The whiskey glass hit the mahogany desk with a sound like a verdict. Kale stared at the documents spread before him, each page crisp and damning in the cold light of the 42nd floor. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Hong Kong's harbor glittered like scattered diamonds against black velvet, beautiful, indifferent, and just as dangerous as the man sitting across from him. Ren Zhihai, chairman of the Zhihai Group, head of the Crescent Tide Syndicate, the alpha whose name made bankers sweat and rivals disappear. And apparently Kale's new employer. You've reviewed the terms. It wasn't a question. Ren's voice was low and precisely controlled, the kind of voice that had learned early that volume was unnecessary when everyone in the room was already afraid of you. He was 41 to Kale's 32, sharp jaw, dark hair cut with surgical precision, a scar running through his left brow that no expensive surgeon had ever been asked to remove. He wore it like punctuation. Kale kept his expression neutral. His Omega biology was doing uncomfortable things, picking up the cedar and black pepper scent rolling off Ren in quiet waves, cataloging it, filing it somewhere inconvenient. He'd been on suppressants for 5 years, reliable ones, his own ones. He wasn't stupid enough to trust anything in this building. 6-month contract, Kale said, setting down the document. Lead architect on the Kowloon Meridian development, full creative authority, above market compensation, private studio space. He paused. And a non-disclosure agreement that covers everything I see, hear, or breathe within 100 meters of your operations. Ren's mouth curved, not quite a smile, more like the memory of one. You read carefully. I always read carefully. Kale leaned back in the chair, crossing one leg over the other with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned to perform confidence long before he felt it. What I don't understand is why you need me specifically. There are 30 senior architects in this city with better credentials. There are 30 senior architects in this city who would redesign the Meridian into something safe. Ren's dark eyes moved across Kale's face with an attention that felt less like attraction and more like appraisal, the way a collector looked at something he'd already decided to acquire. You design buildings that feel like inevitability, like they were always meant to be there. A pause. I want that for the Meridian. Kale ignored the small, treacherous warmth in his chest. Compliments from men like Ren Zhihai were currency, not kindness. And the NDA. Standard for all contractors at this level. The clause on page 9 isn't standard. Kale tapped the relevant section. It gives your legal team the right to review all personal communications during the contract period. Silence, the harbor lights rippled below them. Ren picked up his own glass, took a measured sip, and set it down without breaking eye contact. A precaution. Against what? Against the kind of people who send architects into positions of proximity for reasons that have nothing to do with architecture. The words landed with surgical precision. Kale kept his face perfectly still while something cold moved through him. He'd been briefed on Ren's paranoia. The intelligence file his handler had provided described it as a defining characteristic, a survival mechanism honed over 20 years of building an empire in the negative spaces of legality. It didn't mean Ren knew anything. It didn't mean he didn't. I'm just an architect, Kale said. Ren's expression didn't change. Everyone who sits in that chair is just something. He gestured at the documents. Sign or don't, the Meridian breaks ground in 8 weeks regardless, but it will be better with you. Kale looked at the contract. Looked at the city below, all that glittering ambition spread out like a promise. He thought about his sister's hospital bills, about the loan that was eating his family alive, about the handler who'd appeared 6 months ago with a manila folder and a very specific offer. Get close to Ren Zhihai, document his financial operations, disappear. Simple, clean, except nothing about the man across from him looked simple. He picked up the pen. The ink was barely dry when Ren spoke again. One more thing. His tone was the same, controlled, precise, unremarkable. You'll be working from the residential tower, my building, my floor. A pause that had weight to it. I prefer proximity to my projects. Kale's hand stilled. That's not in the contract. Consider it a verbal addendum. I have my own apartment. Which you'll keep. Ren stood, and Kale was reminded again of the sheer physical fact of him. 6'2", built with the particular density of someone who'd earned his body rather than cultivated it. The tattoo at his collar, a coiled serpent just visible above his shirt's top button, seemed to shift in the light. But your studio will be on my floor, your working hours will overlap with mine. And when the Meridian faces the inevitably complicated moments that all ambitious projects face, his eyes moved to Kale's with something that wasn't quite warmth and wasn't quite threat. I want you accessible. Accessible, the word sat wrong, or maybe it sat too right. Please hit that subscribe button. It's completely free, and I wanted to ask you about past commit and commit section. I am promising you I will read every single commit and try to reply to it. You're used to people agreeing to things they haven't thought through, Kale said. Most people. Ren moved toward the door with the unhurried confidence of someone who'd never been chased. You're not most people, that's why I chose you. He paused at the threshold, hand on the frame. My assistant will show you to the studio. Welcome to the Zhihai Group, Kale. He was gone before Kale could manufacture a response. Kale sat alone in the 42nd floor silence, contract signed, harbor glittering below him, and felt the first faint vibration of something he had no language for, not quite dread, not quite anticipation. The specific frequency of a cage door that hadn't closed yet but had definitely just been located. His phone buzzed in his pocket, handler's number, confirmation received, you're in, clock starts now. Kale looked at the skyline, beautiful, dangerous, indifferent. Clock starts now. His studio was obscene. That was the only word for it. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides, north-facing light that architects spent careers praying for, a drafting setup that cost more than his first car, and a view of Hong Kong harbor that made the chest ache with something close to grief, the particular grief of being somewhere so beautiful under circumstances so compromised. Kale set down his bag and stood in the center of the room, doing what he always did in new spaces, reading it. The proportions were generous but not excessive. The ceiling height was exactly right, 3.5 meters, enough to breathe, enough to think, not so high that ideas got lost. Someone had specified that, someone who understood that space wasn't just aesthetic, it was psychological. You're measuring the ceiling with your eyes. He turned. The man in the doorway was not Ren. He was younger, mid-20s, with the alert stillness of someone trained in either security or service, and possibly both. Beta, Kale's nose confirmed. Calm, professional, faintly amused. Dao, I manage Chairman Ren's schedule and related matters. A slight pause that somehow communicated entire volumes. The studio is yours to configure as you need. Supplies list is on the tablet. Whatever you request will be delivered within 4 hours. 4 hours, Kale repeated. The chairman dislikes delays. Kale moved to the windows, looking down at the harbor. The residential tower was adjacent to the main Zhihai building, connected by an enclosed bridge on the 38th floor. He'd noted 3 security checkpoints between the lobby and here, cameras in every corridor, 2 guards at the elevator bank who'd looked at him with the specific attention of people who knew exactly who was expected and would notice everything that deviated from that. The studio connects to the main residential floor, Kale asked. Through the interior door, Dow nodded toward the unmarked door to the north wall. The chairman's personal areas are beyond. You'll have access to the shared spaces, the library, the kitchen, the terrace. The private wing requires a separate access code. The private wing, where the records would be, where anything useful to his handler would live. And if I need to work late, Kale kept his voice neutral, architectural curiosity, nothing more. The building is accessible 24 hours. You'll have a key card for this floor. Dow produced it, held it out, though the chairman's security team does conduct regular checks for everyone's safety. For everyone's safety, right? Kale took the key card. Does he do this with all his contractors, house them on his personal floor? Dow's expression remained perfectly professional. No, he said simply, and then because apparently that wasn't enough, no, he does not. After Dow left, Kale stood alone in the beautiful studio and turned the key card over in his fingers. He thought about the way Ren had looked at him across the desk. Not with desire, or not only with desire, but with the particular attention of someone cataloging a thing they intended to understand completely. I prefer proximity to my projects. Kale was the project. He pulled out his personal phone and opened the architectural files for the Meridian. 48 stories of mixed-use development in one of Kowloon's most contested redevelopment zones. Ambitious, complicated, and now that he was actually looking at the preliminary designs, genuinely extraordinary. Whoever had started this had understood something rare about the relationship between structure and landscape, about how buildings could belong to their geography instead of simply occupying it. Despite himself, despite everything, something in his chest caught fire. Careful, he told himself, that's exactly what he's counting on. A knock at the interior door, then without waiting for an answer, it opened. Ren stood with his jacket off, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, holding 2 cups of coffee with the casual ownership of a man in his own territory, which of course he was. He looked at Kale, looked at the untouched drafting table, looked at the Meridian files open on the phone in Kale's hand. You've been staring at those for 20 minutes, Ren said. You've been watching me for 20 minutes, Kale returned. Something shifted at the corner of Ren's mouth. He set one of the coffees on the drafting table, black, Kale noticed, which was exactly how he took it and which he had told no one, and moved to stand beside him at the window. The north facade, Ren said, tell me what's wrong with it. Kale looked at his phone, at the preliminary design, at the north facade that had been bothering him since he'd first reviewed the files 3 days ago during his mission briefing when he was supposed to be memorizing Ren's financial patterns and had instead spent 40 minutes staring at the architectural schematics. The curtain wall system doesn't account for the harbor wind patterns above the 30th floor, Kale said. At sustained speed, you'll get resonance frequencies that will make the upper residential units unbearable to live in. Not dangerous, just miserable, like living inside a low hum you can never quite locate. Silence. Ren looked at the schematic on Kale's phone. His expression was unreadable. My previous architect flagged wind loads, Ren said. He didn't mention resonance. Wind loads are structural, resonance is experiential, different discipline. And you noticed this in, Ren checked his watch, the 20 minutes since you arrived. I noticed it 3 days ago. The admission came out before Kale could stop it, when I was reviewing the project brief before accepting. Another silence, longer this time. Ren turned from the window and looked at Kale with an expression that had shifted from appraisal to something more uncomfortable, something that looked, for just a moment, like genuine surprise. Fix it, he said. I'll need access to the structural engineering reports. You'll have them tonight. And the wind tunnel data from the preliminary environmental study. Tomorrow morning. And I want to walk the site. Kale met his eyes. Twice, before I commit to any changes, I don't redesign from drawings. I redesign from standing in the place and understanding what it's trying to be. Ren looked at him for a long moment. The harbor light moved across his face. The serpent tattoo at his collar was fully visible now, with his shirt open at the throat, coiled and patient, as though it had all the time in the world. First site visit is Thursday, Ren said. I'll take you myself. That's not necessary. I'm aware. Ren picked up his own coffee from where he'd set it on the window ledge. Thursday, 7 a.m. dress for a construction site. He moved toward the interior door. The resonance issue, how would you solve it? Kale turned back to the schematic. Something in him was already running the calculations, already seeing the solution the way he always saw them, not as engineering problems, but as spatial arguments that needed better logic. Tuned mass dampers integrated into the facade system, he said, but positioned aesthetically, not mechanically. Make them part of the building's visual language instead of hiding them. A pause. The building wants to respond to the wind, not resist it. You just have to let it. The interior door clicked shut. Kale stood alone in the studio, coffee in hand, harbor spreading below him, and realized with a cold, sinking clarity that he was in serious trouble. Not because Ren Jihai was dangerous. He'd known that before he'd signed the contract. But because in 30 minutes, between the ceiling measurement and the curtain wall resonance and the coffee that was exactly right, the most ruthless man in Hong Kong had already started to feel, against all reason and survival instinct, like someone Kale might actually want to know. His handler's second message arrived at midnight. Initial proximity confirmed. Begin Phase 2, access points assessment, report in 72 hours. Kale stared at it in the dark of his studio, city lights moving on the harbor below. Begin Phase 2. He thought about Thursday, about 7 a.m. and a construction site and an alpha who'd looked genuinely surprised that anyone had read his building's schematics before meeting him. He typed back, confirmed. Then he put the phone face down on the drafting table and went back to the resonance problem, because it was real and it mattered, and because sometimes the only way to survive what you'd gotten yourself into was to be so good at your cover that you forgot, for a few hours at a time, what was underneath it. The cage hadn't closed yet, but Kale could hear it breathing. Thursday arrived the way trouble always did, quietly with good weather. Kale was at the tower entrance at 6:55, coffee in hand, wearing the site boots he'd owned since his first construction job at 23 when he'd been nobody, and the buildings he'd dreamed about existed only in sketchbooks held together with rubber bands. The boots were scuffed and honest in a way that nothing else in this building was, and he'd brought them deliberately, a small private act of resistance. This is who I am underneath the contract. Ren was already there. Of course he was. He stood beside a matte black SUV with the specific stillness of someone for whom waiting was not an inconvenience but a tactical position. Dark jacket, work trousers, boots that were expensive but broken in. No tie, no performance of authority, he simply occupied space the way load-bearing walls did, quietly and completely. Beside him stood a man Kale hadn't met yet. Broad, silent, with the flat, evaluating eyes of a former military man and a jaw like poured concrete. Kale, Ren's gaze dropped briefly to the scuffed boots and something moved in his expression, not judgment, the opposite of judgment. This is Mako. He runs site security for all Zhihai construction projects. Mako looked at Kale the way customs officers looked at passports. Thorough, unhurried, professionally suspicious. Architect, he said, one word, somehow a complete sentence. Mako was special forces, Ren offered before. Before what? Kale asked. Before I made him a better offer. Ren opened the SUV door, get in. The drive to Kowloon took 22 minutes through morning traffic that parted around Ren's vehicle with suspicious convenience. Kale sat in the back beside Ren, laptop open, the Meridian schematics spread across his screen, and tried to focus on cantilever load distribution while the alpha beside him occupied his peripheral vision with the patient intensity of a weather system. Cedar and black pepper, Kale's suppressants were doing their job mostly. The north facade fix, Ren said without looking up from his own phone. You said tune mass dampers integrated aesthetically, show me. Kale turned the laptop. He'd sketched it at 2 in the morning because apparently sleep was no longer something he did. Quick lines, but precise, the damper units repositioned as external fins along the upper facade, angled to catch and redirect wind rather than absorb it. The structural necessity transformed into a visual rhythm that made the building look intentional in an entirely new way. Ren was quiet for a long moment. "This changes the building's identity," he said finally. "It completes it," Kale kept his voice even. The original design was trying to say something about tension between the harbor and the skyline, between movement and permanence. The wind was always part of that conversation. Your previous architect just didn't hear it. Ren looked at the sketch, then at Kale, then back at the sketch. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. "Seeing buildings as conversations. Seeing things other people miss." The question landed differently than Kale expected, not flirtatious, not strategic, genuinely curious, with a directness that felt almost disarming from someone who had apparently built an empire on never being transparent about anything. "Since I was 7, Kale said before he could decide whether to say it, "my family lived above a restaurant in a building that was 60 years old and badly converted. I used to trace the original wall lines through the plaster. The building was trying to be what it had been and what it had become at the same time." A pause. "I thought that was interesting." Ren said nothing, but he didn't look away. "What about you?" Kale said, because the silence needed filling and because his handler had been very specific. Personal details, background, vulnerabilities, used proximity to extract. Easier to tell himself that's why he was asking. "The Meridian isn't your first development project, but it's the most ambitious by a significant margin." "Why?" "Because everything before it was necessary," Ren said. "The Meridian is a choice." "A choice to do what?" The SUV turned off the main road, and the half-constructed skeleton of the Meridian rose ahead of them through the morning mist. 48 floors of steel and intention, cranes moving against the sky like enormous slow birds, the smell of concrete and metal and possibility drifting through the vehicle's ventilation. Ren looked at his building the way Kale looked at his sketches. "A choice to build something that will still be standing in 100 years, he said quietly, "something that outlasts the man who commissioned it." Kale looked at him. The Alpha's profile was clean against the sight, jaw set, eyes tracking the construction with a focus that was almost tender. For just a moment, he didn't look like the subject of an intelligence file. He looked like a man who was afraid of being forgotten. "Don't," Kale told himself, "don't do that." "Let's see the site," he said instead. The Meridian's construction site was controlled chaos managed with military precision that Kale suspected owed more to Mako than to any standard project manager. Safety protocols were immaculate. Workers moved with purpose rather than urgency. The site foreman, a weathered woman named Sira who had the handshake of someone who'd been doing this for 30 years, walked Kale through the lower levels with a running commentary that told him everything about what the building was becoming. Ren walked 3 steps behind, watching. "Not the building, Kale." "The foundation depth here," Kale said, crouching at the north corner, running a hand along the concrete pour. "This exceeds the spec requirements by about 15%. "Ren's instruction," Sira said. Kale looked up. "Why?" "Because the original spec was designed to pass regulatory requirements," Ren said from behind him, "not to be correct." "There's a difference." "Always?" Ren crouched beside him, close enough that Kale caught the full weight of his scent in the open air, cedar and black pepper and something underneath, something warmer that his suppressants were less effective against outdoors in the wind, with 6 feet of construction site and morning air between him and the nearest interior space. "Regulatory requirements tell you the minimum a building needs to survive. I build to what a building needs to last." Kale looked at the foundation, then at Ren, who was studying the concrete with the same attention he'd given Kale's sketch. "You over-engineer everything." "I over-engineer the things that matter," a slight pause, "the things I can't afford to lose." The words had more weight than their context required. Kale stood, putting distance between them under the cover of moving to the next inspection point, and told himself the warmth moving through his chest was just the morning air changing temperature. They moved through 3 more levels. Kale asked questions that were 60% genuine architectural inquiry and 40% the careful reconnaissance his handler had outlined: access points, security infrastructure, the relationship between the commercial and residential components, which floors were high operational space versus public-facing development. Ren answered everything. Freely, precisely, without the deflection Kale had expected, as though he'd decided in some private calculation that Kale was allowed to know the shape of the thing he was building. It was either extraordinary trust or a very sophisticated test, and Kale couldn't determine which without more data, and that uncertainty was its own kind of problem. On the 32nd floor, open to the sky, steel skeleton visible against the clouds, harbor glittering distantly through the frame, Ren stopped. "Here," he said. Kale looked around, structural columns cross-bracing the city spread out below in every direction. "What am I looking at?" "This is the Sky Garden floor. Original design has it as standard green space, landscaping, seating, regulatory checkbox." Ren moved to the eastern edge, looking out over the harbor. "I want something else."
What?
A pause below them, the city breathed its enormous, indifferent breath. I don't know yet, that's why I wanted you here. He turned. What does this floor want to be? Kale stood in the center of the open space and did what he always did. He went still, listened to the proportions, felt the wind move through the structural frame, looked at the quality of light coming from four directions and how it changed the space at different intensities. His Omega instincts, the ones he rarely let himself acknowledge professionally, added their own layer, reading the space not just geometrically but atmospherically, sensing where the shelter points were, where the exposure was, where the room breathed. A garden that doesn't pretend to be ground level, he said finally. Most sky gardens make the mistake of trying to recreate what's below lawns, paths, the logic of street level space, but you're 32 floors up, the logic is different. The relationship to the sky is primary, the relationship to the city is secondary. He turned slowly, mapping it. Water feature on the north end, not decorative, structural. It changes the acoustics, creates a sound boundary that makes the space feel enclosed without walls. The planting should be vertical, not horizontal, height rather than spread, things that move in the wind rather than resist it. He stopped. And the floor should be glass reinforced composite, not concrete. Let people see through to the city below, make the height the experience rather than something to be managed.
Silence.
Kale looked up from his internal mapping to find Ren watching him with an expression he hadn't seen before. The appraisal was gone. Something rarer had replaced it, something that sat closer to the vulnerability Kale had caught in the SUV when Ren had talked about outlasting himself.
That's exactly right, Ren said quietly. It's just spatial logic.
No, Ren moved toward him with 3 unhurried steps that crossed the open floor like a statement. It's understanding what something is trying to become and helping it get there. He stopped 2 feet away, near enough. That's not a technical skill.
Kale held his ground. What is it? Empathy, a beat for structures at least.
The wind moved through the frame. Somewhere below them, a crane cable sang its industrial note. Kale was very aware of the 2 feet between them, of his suppressants doing approximately 80% of the job they were supposed to do, of the fact that the last person who'd used the word empathy in a professional context with him had been his graduate thesis advisor, not the head of a criminal syndicate on a 40-story construction site in Kowloon.
We should look at the upper floors, Kale said.
We should. Ren didn't move immediately. His eyes held Kale's for a moment that lasted 1 second too long to be architectural, then he turned toward the stairwell access. After you.
They were back at the tower by noons.
Kale went directly to his studio and stood at the window for a long time before opening his handler's encrypted messaging app. Site visit completed, security layout partially mapped, operational floors 3842 in residential tower, physical access to financial infrastructure likely requires access code for private wing, timeline 3-4 weeks minimum before any extraction attempt is viable.
He paused, added.
Subject is not behaving according to profile parameters. Reassessment may be required. He sent it, then he pulled out his sketchbook, the real one, not the digital files, and started drawing the sky garden floor because the idea was real and it mattered and he'd meant everything he'd said about what it wanted to become. His handler's response came in under 4 minutes. Profile deviation noted. Maintain proximity. Emotional attachment is an asset, not a liability. Use it. Stay the course.
Emotional attachment is an asset.
Kale looked at the words, then at his sketch of a 30-second floor that could be something extraordinary, then out at the harbor where Hong Kong kept glittering with its beautiful, dangerous, indifferent light.
His interior door knocked once.
Lunch, Ren's voice through the wood, no request in it, and this was the thing Kale was beginning to notice, no command either, something in between that he didn't have a word for yet.
I'm working, Kale called back.
A beat, the kitchen has a view of the harbor from the west side, better light for drawing than the studio at this hour. Kale looked at his sketchbook, at the studio's midday light, which was in fact slightly harsh from the south-facing reflection off the neighboring tower.
He hated that Ren had noticed that. He hated more that Ren was right. He picked up his sketchbook and opened the interior door.
Ren was already walking toward the kitchen. He didn't look back to see if Kale was following, didn't need to.
The cage hadn't closed. But Kale had just walked through the door.
Lunch was simple, expensive ingredients prepared simply, which Kale was learning was Ren's aesthetic across everything, the building, the office, apparently the kitchen. They sat at the west-facing counter with their food and the harbor light pouring in at the angle Ren had predicted, and Kale sketched the sky garden while Ren worked through documents that he didn't angle away from Kale's line of sight. That detail lodged itself. Most people, and particularly most people in Ren's position, would have closed folders, angled screens, maintained the instinctive information security of the perpetually guarded. Ren simply worked, as though the concept of hiding things from Kale in his own kitchen hadn't occurred to him.
Either he's completely comfortable or he's showing me what he wants me to see. Or the third option Kale kept refusing to consider, he simply trusted him.
Your suppressants, Ren said without looking up from his documents.
Kale's pencil stopped. Excuse me. They're strong, I can barely read your base scent. Ren turned a page, still not looking up, entirely conversational. Most omegas in professional environments use a moderate dose, enough to prevent heat complications, not enough to eliminate scent signature entirely. I prefer a complete suppression. I know, now he looked up, I'm not asking you to change it, I'm nodding that it's a choice that takes effort. A pause, what are you suppressing against? The question was so direct it almost read as rude. Kale processed it from 3 angles simultaneously: the intelligence angle, the personal angle, the angle that was simply the experience of being asked something real by someone who appeared to want a real answer. Professional context, Kale said carefully. Scent signals create dynamics I'd rather not navigate in a work environment. Alpha attention. Power imbalances. Ren looked at him, set his pen down, which was a gesture Kale was beginning to associate with the moments when Ren decided to be deliberate. I'm an alpha in a position of significant power over your professional situation. You're an omega in my building, working on my project, eating lunch at my counter. A beat. The power imbalance exists regardless of your suppressant dosage. I'm aware, Kale said, that's why the dosage is what it is. Something moved at the corner of Ren's mouth, not the almost smile from yesterday, something more honest than that. Fair, he said, and went back to his documents. Kale went back to his sketch. They worked in silence for 40 minutes that felt nothing like silence. It felt like conversation conducted in a different language, one Kale didn't have a complete vocabulary for yet but was already learning against his will. His phone buzzed, personal number, his sister Wei. He looked at the message, Dad's next treatment is next week. The payment portal is asking for confirmation, is it okay? His stomach dropped. The handler had cleared his family's medical debt that had been part of the arrangement, but it was conditional, it was always conditional. Stay the course, deliver the data, keep the cover. He typed back, yes, confirm it, everything's fine. He put the phone face down on the counter. Ren, without looking up, everything all right? Fine, Kale said. The lie tasted exactly like every other lie he'd told in this building, easy on the outside, corrosive underneath. You don't have to say fine if it isn't. Ren's voice was neutral, informational. I find that most people say fine as a way of ending a conversation they haven't decided to have yet. Kale looked at him, do you always dissect what people say? I listen carefully, a slight pause, it's kept me alive. Kale thought about the intelligence file, about the 4 assassination attempts documented by his handler's briefing, about the man who'd built an empire by surviving things that killed everyone around him and had apparently done it primarily by paying very close attention to what people revealed when they thought they were concealing. Family situation, Kale said, not a lie, not the truth, the exact edge between them, it's managed. Ren nodded once, didn't push, went back to his documents. Kale looked at his sketch of the sky garden, at the vertical planting and the glass floor and the water feature that would make the height the experience rather than the thing to be managed. Use the emotional attachment, his handler had said. He was beginning to understand with a cold and clarifying dread that the problem wasn't whether he could do that. The problem was that it was already running in both directions. 3 weeks into the contract, Kale stopped sleeping properly. It wasn't the studio. The studio was perfect, obscenely so, with its north-facing light and its harbor view and the drafting setup that had started to feel less like borrowed equipment and more like something that had always been his. It wasn't the building, which had its own rhythms he'd learned the way he learned all buildings, by listening until the structure told him what it needed. It was the door. The interior door between his studio and Ren's private floor. The one that knocked once every evening around 7, which was when Ren returned from whatever the Jihai group required of him during the hours Kale spent drawing and measuring and mapping, and pretending his handler's messages weren't accumulating unanswered in an encrypted app he'd started opening less and less. Knock once, never twice. And Kale, who had excellent professional boundaries and a mission timeline and approximately 47 reasons to maintain strict personal distance from the subject of his intelligence operation, kept opening it. Tonight the knock came at 7:12. Kale was deep in the revised facade specifications, pencil behind his ear, harbor lights beginning their nightly display below, and he opened the door before he'd made a conscious decision to do so. Ren was in a gray shirt, sleeves rolled, the serpent tattoo fully visible, holding a bottle of something amber with the ease of a man who decided the evening was going to be a particular way and hadn't yet consulted anyone else about it. The Sky Garden proposal, he said, I showed it to the development board today. Kale leaned against the doorframe and 3 of them want to eliminate the glass floor, liability concerns. Ren's expression communicated precisely what he thought of that. 1 wants to replace the vertical planting with a rooftop bar concept, revenue generation. What did you say? I said the architect's vision was non-negotiable. He held up the bottle. Come and tell me if I was right. The library was Kale's favorite room in the building.
which was a problem because it was deep in Ren's private wing behind the access-coded door that his handler had specifically identified as a primary target, and it was Kale's favorite room because it was extraordinary. Floor-to-ceiling shelves on 3 walls. Architecture, history, economics, philosophy in 7 languages. Kale had checked, partly from genuine curiosity, and partly because a person's library was a more accurate intelligence file than anything his handler could compile. One entire wall was glass, overlooking the harbor, and someone, Ren, Kale had concluded, because the precision was too specific to be delegated, had positioned the reading chairs at the exact angle where the harbor light hit in the evening without glare. Empirical evidence that the man understood space as experience. This was the 4th time this week Kale had been in this room. He told himself each time that he was mapping the private wing, documenting access points, fulfilling his operational brief. He was also reading Ren's books and arguing with him about structural philosophy until 11 p.m. and experiencing the specific torture of genuinely enjoying it. The glass floor isn't a liability, Kale said, settling into the chair that had become, over 3 weeks, implicitly his. It's an intentional relationship with risk. People choose to engage with it or they don't, that's the point. That's what I said. Ren poured 2 glasses with the economical precision of someone who'd grown up doing things correctly rather than abundantly. They heard danger, I heard honesty. Most people find honesty dangerous. Most people are correct. He handed Kale his glass and sat across from him, and for a moment they were simply 2 people in a room full of books with good whiskey and harbor light, which was the lie Kale had started telling himself in the gaps between handler messages and mission timelines. Just this, just here, just tonight. You're bored, Kale said. How much of the meridian do they actually understand? They understand the financial projections. Ren swirled his glass. The yield models, the pre-sales data, the development is a vehicle for returns. But not to you. No, he looked at the harbor. To me, it's what I said in the car, something that lasts. Why does lasting matter so much to you? The question came out quieter than Kale intended, more genuine, less operational. Ren was quiet for a long moment. The harbor lights moved on the water. Somewhere in the building's infrastructure, something settled, a small structural sound, the tower breathing. My mother, he said finally. She was a restoration architect, small practice. She spent her career working on buildings that other people had almost destroyed, water damage, neglect, bad renovations. She'd go into a building that everyone had given up on and find what it had originally been and bring it back. A pause. She said the best buildings have a memory, a structural memory of what they were built to be. Even if everything visible has been damaged, the bones remember. Kale's chest did something inconvenient. She sounds remarkable. She died when I was 15. Flat, factual, the voice of someone who'd had 26 years to make the grief into something load-bearing. Before she finished the last project she was working on, an old colonial building in Xungwan, she'd been at it for 3 years. His jaw tightened fractionally. I had it completed when I had enough money to do it properly. Took another 7 years. It opened as a cultural center when I was 31. That's why you over-engineer the foundations, Kale said slowly, the things that matter. Ren looked at him, because she taught me that bones are everything. If the bones are right, you can survive almost anything happening to the surface. Kale thought about his own bones, about the architecture of who he was underneath the cover identity and the mission brief and the suppressants, and the 5 years of professional performance that had made him good at exactly the kind of contained, controlled existence that made him useful to people who needed someone invisible. My mother is an engineer, Kale said. He hadn't planned to say it. It came from the same place the 7-year-old tracing wall lines through plaster had come from, some recess below the tactical, below the careful, civil. She designed drainage systems for half the residential developments in Taipei for 20 years, unglamorous work. Nobody notices drainage until it fails. A pause. She used to say that the most important architecture is always invisible. The part that makes everything else possible. Ren was watching him with that attention, the full-weight attention that made Kale feel both exposed and irrationally safe. She's right, Ren said. She usually is, Kale looked at his glass. She's also currently relying on my father's ongoing medical care not to bankrupt the family, so, he stopped, too much, too real. 3 weeks in this room and his operational discipline was developing structural cracks. Forget that. I won't forget it, Ren's voice was quiet, but I won't use it against you either. The words landed with a weight Kale wasn't prepared for. He looked up. Ren met his eyes with an expression that was completely undefended, which was somehow more unsettling than the controlled precision he wore in every other context. Everyone in my world uses everything, Ren said. I know what that looks like, I know what it smells like. His eyes moved briefly, meaningfully, to Kale's collar where the suppressants did their work. I know the difference between someone who's guarding themselves and someone who's been given reason to. Kale's blood ran cold, warm, both simultaneously. Ren, I'm not asking questions. He refilled both glasses with that same economical precision. I'm saying I've noticed, and I'd like you to know that whatever brought you here, whatever the complicated thing is that you're carrying, I'm not interested in weaponizing it. A pause. I'm interested in the glass floor and the vertical planting and what this building wants to become. The rest is yours. Kale stared at him. Why, he asked, and his voice came out rower than he'd intended. Ren looked at the harbor, because the last person who sat in that chair and talked about buildings like they were alive died when I was 15. He was quiet for a moment, and because I find I can't be ruthless about everything simultaneously, something has to be allowed to simply exist. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that had texture, that meant something in the specific grain of it. Kale sat in it and felt the mission timeline ticking somewhere behind his ribs and felt, beneath that, something else, something that didn't have a tactical category. His phone buzzed, handler's number. He looked at it, looked at Ren, who was looking at the harbor and not at the phone, giving him the privacy of not watching. He turned it face down without reading the message. Just tonight, just this, just here. Careful, said the part of him that was still trying to survive. Careful, careful, careful. The financial records were on the server in Ren's office. Kel knew this because in 3 weeks of working dinners and library evenings and site visits, he'd mapped the private wing with the thoroughness his architectural brain applied to all spaces, not deliberately, not as surveillance, but because he couldn't be in a building without understanding it. The office was off the library, northeast corner. Ren worked there from 6 to 9 most mornings and again from 10 to midnight. The server hardware was behind the desk. The safe was behind the painting of a building Kale had eventually recognized as the colonial restoration Ren had completed for his mother's memory, which had been a gut punch he hadn't been prepared for. He knew the access code for the private wing. He'd watched Ren enter it 11 times. He knew Ren's working patterns, his security rotation preferences, the 40-minute window between Mako's first and second overnight check where the office could be accessed without crossing a camera blind spot. He had everything he needed, had had it for 10 days. His handler's messages had gone from professional to urgent to something that was beginning to resemble threat. Phase 2 overdue, financial data required, confirm status. Then non-response noted, review your contractual obligations, agent. Then 3 days ago, the message that had kept Kale awake until 3 a.m. Your father's treatment facility has been contacted regarding payment restructuring. You have 72 hours. 72 hours, 68 of which had now passed. Kale sat in his studio at 2 in the morning with his sketchbook and his handler's messages and the access code he hadn't used, and tried to locate the person he'd been before this building, before this floor, before a man who over-engineered foundations and finished his dead mother's last project and used the word empathy about Kale's spatial instincts had become the central fact of his daily existence. Use the attachment, his handler had said. He'd thought that meant Ren's attachment to him. He'd been catastrophically wrong about the direction. The interior door knocked once. Kale looked at the clock. 2:14 a.m. Ren never knocked at 2 in the morning. Ren was precise about his schedule the way load-bearing elements were precise about their function. He opened the door. Ren looked like he hadn't slept, shirt untucked, which Kale had never seen, something in his expression that was contained but barely, the look of a man who'd received very bad news and was deciding what shape to pour it into. The Cheng Consortium pulled their pre-sale commitments, he said, 40% of the Meridian's residential funding as of tonight. Kale absorbed this. Why? Pressure, Ren's jaw was tight. External, someone reached out to them with information about Jihai Group's operations, enough to make them nervous about the association. He looked at Kale directly, confidential information, the kind that requires inside access. The cold started at Kale's spine and moved outward. The Cheng Consortium's withdrawal triggers a refinancing clause, Ren continued, which creates a 6-week vulnerability in the Meridian's development timeline, which is a very specific problem for a very specific project. His eyes hadn't left Kale's. Someone who understood the Meridian's financing structure in detail would know exactly how to cause maximum disruption with minimum visible fingerprints. Kale's voice was steady, barely. I'm not accusing you, the words were precise, almost gentle, almost. I'm telling you what's happened, I'm telling you because you're my architect and this affects your project. A pause that had geological weight, and because if there's something I should know about why this is happening, now would be the time. Kale looked at him, at the exhausted, controlled, barely contained man in the doorway who had just told him that now would be the time with an expression that looked less like interrogation and more like desperate hope that the answer would be the right one. His handler had done this. Not Kale, his handler, running a parallel operation, using Kale's access mapping to squeeze the Meridian's financing, creating pressure to force Kale to act or to destabilize Ren's position regardless. Acceptable collateral, his handler had said about Kale's family. Now the Meridian was collateral too. Now everything Ren had built towards something lasting was collateral. I need to tell you something, Kale said. Ren went very still. Not tonight, Kale's voice cracked on the last word. I need to figure out how to say it first, I need a day. Something moved across Ren's face, complicated, the surface of something deep being disturbed.
Does it involve the Meridian?
Yes.
Does it involve Zhihai Group's operations?
Yes.
A long silence, the harbor moved below them in the dark. Does it involve you? Ren asked. And his voice had gone to something Kale had never heard from him before, something that had shed all the control and precision and was just a man asking a question he was afraid of the answer to.
Yes, Kale said, I'm sorry, yes.
Ren looked at him for a long moment, then he nodded once, with the slow deliberateness of someone making a decision they knew would cost them. Tomorrow evening, he said, in the library.
Yes.
And Kale, he paused in the doorway, not turning back, just his profile against the hallway light. Whatever it is, I need you to know I've seen it coming for 3 weeks. A beat. I've been waiting to see if you'd tell me yourself. He walked back into the private wing, and the door closed behind him with a sound like a sentence that hadn't finished yet. Kale stood in his studio, 2 in the morning, harbor below him, and understood with absolute clarity that the confession he'd been avoiding was no longer a choice. It was just a question of whether it would destroy everything before he could save any of it. He opened his handler's app, typed, "Your Cheng Consortium operation has compromised the mission, stand down or I walk." The response came in 90 seconds. "You walk, your father's facility loses funding tonight. Stay the course, deliver or suffer the consequences."
Kale stared at the message.
Then he opened a second app, the one he'd never used. The emergency contact his handler's superior had provided at the beginning of the operation in case the handler went rogue. Because handlers did go rogue. Because intelligence operations were run by human beings who had their own agendas and their own acceptable collateral lists and their own definitions of the mission that didn't always match the official version. He typed 6 words into the emergency line. "Handler has gone off protocol, requesting review." Then he put the phone down and picked up his sketchbook and drew the sky garden floor until dawn came up over the harbor. Because tomorrow evening he was going to walk into the library and tell Ren Zhihai the truth, and he needed to spend the remaining hours being certain, absolutely certain, that it was his own choice and not just the next thing someone was making him do. Outside, Hong Kong breathed its enormous breath. The buildings settled around him. The bones remember, Ren's mother had said, even if everything visible has been damaged. Kale pressed his hand flat against the studio wall and felt the structure beneath. The deliberate, over-engineered, permanent structure of someone who'd been told once that bones were everything. Hold, he thought at the building, just hold. He was at the Sky Garden site by 6 a.m. Mako found him there at 6:15, which told Kale something about Mako's surveillance protocols that he filed away for reasons he couldn't entirely justify as professional.
Early, Mako said. Couldn't sleep.
Mako stood beside him at the eastern edge, 32 floors up, city spreading below in the early gray light. He was quiet for a long time in the way of someone comfortable with silence because they'd learned to listen to what it contained. "The chairman doesn't sleep either," Mako said finally, "when something matters." Kale looked at him. "How long have you worked for him?" 11 years. Mako's flat eyes tracked a cargo ship moving on the harbor below. "Since I was 28, and the alternative was significantly worse."
What was the alternative?
People who were less particular about what their people did. A pause. "Ren is many things, but he has a line. Everything he does, the things that look like ruthlessness, they're on one side of that line." He glanced at Kale sideways. "He's never hurt someone who didn't choose to come at him first." The intelligence file Kale had been given said something different. It described Ren as an aggressor, an expansionist, a man who eliminated competition through coercion and worse. 3 weeks of proximity had been quietly, persistently suggesting that the file was incomplete in ways that might matter enormously. "The Cheng withdrawal," Kale said carefully, "is the Meridian going to survive it?" Mako was quiet. "Ren will find a solution, he always does." Another pause, but it was a targeted hit, someone who understood the financing structure specifically. His flat eyes moved to Kale again, not accusatory, reading.
"I know," Kale said.
"I know you know," Mako said. They stood in the early morning on the 32nd floor and looked at the city below them. "He trusted you with the private wing access," Mako said. "That's not something he does."
"I know that too."
"Then you know what it means, not a question, and you know what it will mean if that trust is misplaced." Kale looked at the floor that would someday be glass, at the city that would someday be visible through it, at the space that was currently just steel and possibility and the question of what it wanted to become.
"I'm going to tell him tonight," Kale said, "everything."
Mako said nothing for a long time, then, "Everything is a complicated word in this building."
"I know.
It might not go the way you're hopping."
"I know that too."
Another silence. The city below them woke up in increments. Lights coming on, traffic beginning, the enormous daily machinery of 8 million lives grinding into motion. "He won't hurt you," Mako said quietly. "Whatever happens, that's not who he is." A pause. "But he might disappear you from himself, and in this building, that's its own kind of damage."
Kale thought about the library and the reading chair that had become implicitly his, and the whiskey poured with economical precision, and the word empathy and the colonial building completed 7 years late for a woman who taught her son that bones were everything. I know, he said for the fourth time. It was the most honest thing he'd said in 3 weeks. Mako nodded once, with the dignity of a man who respected honesty even when it arrived too late and too complicated to be clean. Then he went back to his patrol, and Kale stood on the 32nd floor alone as the city fully woke around him and counted down the hours to the library. 7 p.m. was coming. The bones remember even damage, even this. Even the moment right before everything changed. 7 p.m. arrived like a sentence being read aloud. Kale stood outside the library door for 30 seconds, he counted, with his hand not quite touching the wood, running through every version of the conversation he'd rehearsed since dawn. Every approach, every sequence, every careful arrangement of words that might make the truth land as something survivable rather than something terminal. None of them were adequate. He opened the door. Ren was already there, of course he was, standing at the harbor window with his back to the door, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a glass he hadn't drunk from. The evening light caught the angles of him in a way that made Kale's chest do its now familiar inconvenient thing. The thing he'd stopped pretending wasn't happening approximately 10 days ago, when he'd caught himself spending 20 minutes deciding which of Ren's architectural opinions he disagreed with most, because disagreeing with Ren was the closest thing to conversation he'd ever found that felt like being fully awake. The room smelled of cedar and black pepper and something underneath that Kale's suppressants could no longer fully manage. Hadn't been able to fully manage for a week, he'd been pretending otherwise. Ren didn't turn around. Sit down, he said, quiet, controlled, the voice of someone who'd been composing himself for hours. Kale sat, not in his usual chair. He chose the one directly across from where Ren would sit, the less comfortable one, the one that didn't have 3 weeks of evenings worn into it. Some instinct for honesty demanded he not use the comfortable chair tonight. Ren turned, set his glass down with that precise care, sat across from him, looked at him with the full weight attention that had always felt like being read, except tonight there was something beneath it, something raw and braced, the expression of a man who'd already decided to hear whatever was coming and had spent his preparation time building the structure to survive it rather than prevent it. Tell me, he said just that. So Kale told him. He started at the beginning because the beginning was the only honest place to start. 18 months ago, a handler who'd appeared with a manila folder and a very specific problem, Kale's family, his father's medical debt, the loan that was eating them alive, the particular vulnerability of people who had too much love and not enough money to protect it. He told Ren about the recruitment, about the mission brief that had described Ren as the architect of a financial network laundering money for 3 major syndicates, funding operations that touched trafficking and weapons, and the kind of political corruption that stayed invisible specifically because the money behind it was untraceable. He told Ren about coming to Hong Kong, about the 6-month plan, about an architecture background that made him useful and an Omega status that made him invisible and a debt that made him motivated. He told Ren about the first site visit and the Sky Garden floor and the 32 floors up where Ren had asked what the space wanted to become, and Kale had answered honestly before he decided to. He told Ren about the library evenings, about the access mapping he'd done, about the server behind the office desk and the safe behind the restoration painting and the access code he'd memorized and never used. He told Ren about his handler's escalating pressure, about the Cheng Consortium, which hadn't been Kale's operation but had been run using his access mapping, about the 72-hour ultimatum and the treatment facility and the message that said acceptable collateral about a child Kale didn't have yet and the people he loved most. He told Ren about the emergency contact, about the message he'd sent at 2 in the morning reporting his handler for going off protocol. He told Ren about standing on the 32nd floor at 6 a.m. telling Mako he was going to say everything, knowing it might cost him everything. He said all of it in the same even voice he used for structural assessments, because if he let the voice go he would lose the thread entirely, and the thread was the only thing keeping him in the chair rather than running from the expression on Ren's face. Which didn't change, through all of it Ren's face didn't change. That was somehow worse than any reaction. When Kale finished, the silence lasted long enough that the harbor lights outside completed a full rotation cycle on the water. Then Ren said, "How long before you stopped reporting?" Kale blinked. Of all the questions, 5 weeks in after the second site visit, a pause. "I stopped because the reports felt like filing evidence against someone I was beginning to understand, and understanding changed things." "What things?" "The file my handler gave me said you were a predator, expansionist, that the laundering operation was how you maintained leverage over 3 syndicates simultaneously." Kale held Ren's gaze. 3 weeks of proximity told me the file was incomplete, maybe deliberately. The Zhihai Group's financial structure is sophisticated, but it's structured for defensibility, not offense. You're not funding syndicates. He paused because this was the part that had kept him awake longest. You're insulated from them. You've built something that looks like collaboration and functions like a wall. Ren was very still. Your money flow documentation, Kale continued. The pieces I saw before you pulled the cables, the shell company structures, they're not laundering infrastructure, they're buffer architecture designed to make your legitimate operations look connected to syndicate money so that anyone investigating thinks they understand the relationship. He looked at Ren directly. But the actual capital flows don't connect. The buffers are real, but the laundering isn't. You built a reputation for being exactly the kind of criminal that intelligence agencies would want to surveil, so that the actual surveillance never looks at what you're really doing. The silence stretched. Which is building the Meridian, Kale said quietly, and completing your mother's last project and over-engineering foundations. And his voice threatened to crack, and keeping a reading chair at the right angle so the harbor light doesn't cause glare. Ren stood. He walked to the harbor window and stood with his back to Kale again, one hand on the glass, and Kale watched his shoulders carry the weight of something enormous. The file your handler gave you, Ren said to the harbor, how detailed was it? Comprehensive, 18 months of surveillance, enough to build a thorough picture. And it said I was laundering for 3 syndicates. Russian-Chinese domestic coalition. And you believed it. At first, Kale's hands were clasped between his knees. I was given reasons to believe it. My family's situation made believing easier than questioning. And now I think your handler and mine might be working from the same bad information, or the same deliberately falsified information. He paused. Someone wants you destabilized. The Cheng Consortium operation was designed to make you vulnerable during the Meridian's most critical financing window. That's not intelligence gathering, that's an attack. Ren's hand on the glass pressed harder. Kale watched the tendons in his wrist. 4 years, Ren said. I've spent 4 years building the buffer architecture, building a reputation that keeps the real syndicates convinced I'm useful to them while keeping my actual operations completely clean. A long pause. My legal team, my financial advisors, 3 government contacts who know the truth, that's everyone. His hand dropped from the glass. And a handler somewhere sent an architect to take it apart. I didn't take it apart, Kale's voice was low. I'm telling you what was sent at it. Ren turned. And his face now, the face he'd been withholding through the entire confession, was something Kale had no category for. Not rage. Not the betrayal rage of the intelligence file's description of a man who'd eliminated rivals for lesser provocations. Something more complicated. Something that looked like a man standing in the damage of something he'd been afraid to want and finding it was still partially standing. You sent the emergency report, Ren said, before you came here tonight. Yes, why? Because my handler is off protocol and the operation he's running isn't intelligence collection anymore. It's targeted destabilization using me as a delivery mechanism. Kale met his eyes. And because I won't be a weapon aimed at you, whatever else I've done, I won't be that. Even though you're family. I'll find another way to protect my family. His voice broke slightly on the last word. He let it. There are things I'm not willing to do to people who to you. The harbor light moved across Ren's face. His expression shifted again, through something Kale couldn't track, and settled into something quieter and more dangerous than anything Kale had seen from him. Come here, he said. Kale stood, crossed the room, stopped 2 feet away, which had been their distance, had always been their distance, negotiated silently across 3 weeks of evening conversations, close enough for honesty, far enough for the fiction of professional separation. Ren reached out and put one hand on Kale's jaw, not hard, not possessive the way Kale had been braced for from the moment he'd crossed the room, just present, the full warm weight of a hand that knew how to be precise. You're an idiot, Ren said. Despite everything, something in Kale's chest cracked open. I know. You had every reason to use what you'd mapped. You had your family's safety, a handler threatening termination, months of access. You could have destroyed me cleanly and walked away. Yes, why didn't you? Kale looked at him, at the scar through his left brow, at the serpent tattoo at his collar and the exhaustion underneath his eyes, and the man who'd spent 11 years completing a building for a woman who'd taught him that bones were everything. Because you're not what they said you were, Kale said, and because somewhere between the resonance problem and the sky garden and the whiskey at this exact right angle for harbor light, it stopped mattering what I was sent here to do and started mattering what I was actually doing. Ren's thumb traced Kale's cheekbone once deliberately. What were you actually doing? He asked, voice low, the question under the question entirely visible. Belonging somewhere, Kale said, which I was not supposed to do. Ren's forehead dropped to his. The gesture landed with the weight of something that had been held back for a long time. Cedar and black pepper and warmth and the specific frequency of an alpha in a room where he'd finally stopped performing control.
Kale's Omega instincts, suppressed for 5 years, went absolutely silent in the specific way of things that had found what they were suppressed against.
This is complicated, Ren said. Catastrophically.
Your handler is going to come at this harder when the emergency review flags his operation.
I know.
My buffer architecture just had its existence confirmed to an intelligence operative, which means if your handler talks, the syndicates find out I've been running a containment game for 4 years.
I know that too. And your family is still exposed. Working on it.
A pause, Ren pulled back enough to see Kale's face. His expression had shed the last of its armor, which was terrifying and necessary and somehow the most honest thing in the room.
I should be furious, he said. You should, Kale agreed. I am furious.
I know, but I've also, Ren stopped, jaw tight, working towards something. I've also been waiting for 3 weeks for you to trust me enough to tell me the truth, and you did, tonight, before the handler forced it, before extraction, before the situation made it strategically necessary. His hand on Kale's jaw pressed slightly. You chose to.
Yes.
Now please hit that subscribe button. It's completely free, and I wanted to ask you about past commit and commit section. I am promising you I will read every single commit and try to reply to it. That matters to me, flat, certain. It shouldn't probably. By any rational metric, I should be having Mako escort you out of this building and erasing this entire situation, but it matters.
Ren, Kale's voice was rough. I need you to know something. Tell me.
I'm still an operative with a handler who has my family's safety as leverage. I'm still technically mid-mission. The emergency report I filed might not hold. The situation I've put us both in it's real and it's dangerous, and I'm not standing here asking you to pretend otherwise. He held Ren's gaze. I'm standing here because I'd rather face it honestly than run from it dishonestly, and because you deserve to know exactly what you're working with. Ren looked at him for a long moment. What I'm working with, he said slowly, is an architect with perfect spatial instincts and terrible operational discipline who apparently cannot be in a building for 3 weeks without starting to care about what it's trying to become. His almost smile appeared, broken at the edges, real all the way through. I've worked with worse. Mako appeared at the library door at 8:15 with the timing of a man who'd been positioned outside it for a while. The emergency report your operative filed, he said to Kale without preamble. My contact at the Oversight Bureau confirmed receipt 40 minutes ago. He looked at Ren. Handler's operation is under review. They've frozen his field authority pending investigation.
Ren nodded once. Timeline.
72 hours minimum before he can move against the family assets. Mako's flat eyes moved to Kale. Enough time to put independent protection in place. Kale exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. How? The chairman anticipated you might need family security, Mako said. 2 days ago, his expression didn't change. The chairman anticipates most things.
Kale looked at Ren. You knew, he said.
I suspected. Ren moved to refill the glasses because apparently after catastrophic confessions, the protocol was still good whiskey at the correct angle for Harbor Light. I've had your handler's communications flagged through a third-party network for 10 days, not your communications, he added, preempting the question. The Cheng Consortium approach came from his operation, not yours. That told me the mission had fractured internally. He handed Kale his glass.
I was waiting to see which direction you'd fall. And if I'd fallen the other direction,
then I'd have handled it. Simple, no elaboration. The specific compression of someone who'd made peace with hard outcomes long before they arrived.
My family, Kale said, the protection.
Already arranged, independent of any intelligence operation or handler leverage. Ren held his gaze. Your father's treatment facility will receive a third-party funding guarantee through a legitimate medical foundation. Your mother's financial situation will be stabilized through a housing security fund, both anonymous, both unconditional. A pause, not a transaction, not leverage, because they're yours and he stopped. Because it's the right thing to do.
Kale stared at him. You arranged this before I confessed, he said.
Yes.
Before you knew which direction I'd fall.
Yes.
Why?
Ren set his glass down with that precise care, looked at the harbor, looked back at Kale with an expression that had the quality of something being said for the first time, something that had existed for a while in the private architecture of the man who kept it. Because regardless of what you were sent here to do, you fixed the north facade resonance problem in 20 minutes, and you understood what the Sky Garden was trying to become, and you looked at my buildings the way my mother looked at buildings. His voice dropped. And whatever else is true, those things are real. You're real. The rest is manageable.
Kale's throat tightened. I don't know how to receive this.
You don't have to do anything with it tonight. Ren picked his glass back up. Tonight we drink, tomorrow we deal with the handler situation. Thursday, a faint emphasis, Thursday we go back to the site.
And after Thursday?
Ren looked at him, the harbor light moved across his face. After Thursday we figure out what we're building, he said. The meridian and everything else. He gestured at the space between them with the directness of a man who'd stopped pretending the space was just professional, one structure at a time.
Kale woke at 3 a.m. to his handler's number calling his personal phone. Not a message, a call. The specific escalation of someone whose field authority had just been frozen and who was choosing panic over protocol. He let it ring. It rang 4 times, stopped, then immediately began again. He looked at it in the dark of his studio, harbor below, city breathing. The building settled around him with its over-engineered bones. He answered. Agent, his handler's voice was stripped of its mechanical distortion now, raw, human, and not in a way that made him more sympathetic, just more audible in his fear. You filed an emergency report. I did. You understand what that means for your operation. I understand what it means for yours. Kale kept his voice level. You ran a parallel destabilization operation using my access mapping without my authorization or knowledge. You threatened my family beyond the original agreement parameters. You called my unborn child acceptable collateral. He paused. I don't have an unborn child, but that was the word you used about the possibility, so I have some clarity about your parameters. A silence, then the operation is larger than your personal. Tell me about the syndicates, Kale said. What? The 3 syndicates you briefed me on. Russian, Chinese, domestic coalition. Tell me the specific financial linkages between them and Jihai Group's operations. Give me one concrete transaction, one verifiable data point from 18 months of surveillance. The silence stretched 4 seconds too long. The documentation is classified at a level. You don't have it, Kale said, because it doesn't exist, because Jihai Group isn't laundering for anyone, because whoever built your intelligence file built it to describe the buffer architecture as the real architecture and you either didn't know or didn't care. He kept his voice even, which means the question is who briefed you incorrectly and why. Another silence, longer. You've been compromised, his handler said finally. Your proximity to the subject has compromised your. My proximity to the subject revealed that the mission brief was wrong. Kale looked at the harbor. I'm filing a full operational review, everything including the Cheng Consortium operation you ran on my access mapping, including the family leverage, including the threat parameters. A pause. You have an oversight review starting in approximately 48 hours. I suggest you spend that time deciding how much of what went wrong here you want attributed to bad intelligence versus bad judgment. He ended the call. His hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against the drafting table, against the building, through the table, and felt the bones of the structure absorb the tremor. Hold, he thought, just hold. His phone buzzed, not the handler, a new number clean that he didn't recognize. He answered. Agent, a different voice, female, the specific measured cadence of oversight rather than field operations. This is Director Shen. I'm heading the review your emergency report triggered. A pause. We've been aware of your handler's operation for 6 weeks. We were waiting for an operative to flag it internally. Another pause, waited. You took longer than we hoped. Kale closed his eyes, you knew. We suspected, we needed confirmation from the inside. Her voice was clinical but not unkind. Your handler has been running an unauthorized destabilization campaign against Jihai Group on behalf of a private client, not a syndicate, a development competitor, someone who wants the Meridian project to fail for commercial reasons. A development competitor, Kale repeated slowly. The Kowloon Meridian site was contested by 3 development groups before Ren Jihai secured it. One of those groups has been funding our handler's secondary operation for 14 months. Director Shen's tone was precise. Jihai Group has been under surveillance for legitimate reasons at various points, but the active operation you were recruited for was private, unauthorized, using official infrastructure for commercial sabotage. Kale sat down. My family's debt. Real, your handler had access to certain leverage mechanisms through his official position. He used them outside of authorized parameters. A pause. The protections he threatened to remove are currently being reinstated through proper channels. Your father's treatment facility has already received confirmation. She paused. Though I understand independent arrangements have also been made. She knew about Ren's arrangement, of course she did. What happens now, Kale asked. Your handler is being removed from field operations pending full review. You're being officially stood down from the Jihai surveillance operation effective immediately. A brief pause. There was never a legitimate case against Cho Ren. The brief your handler gave you was fabricated from partial surveillance data that was deliberately misread. Someone needs to tell him that. We're aware, official clearance documentation for Jihai Group's operations will be processed through appropriate channels. A dry note entered her voice, though I suspect Mr. Cho has resources that have already given him a version of this information. Yes, Kale said he does. Then we're in agreement about the situation. Director Shen's voice returned to its baseline precision. You acted correctly, Agent, later than optimal, but correctly. The emergency report will reflect that. A pause. What you do from this point is your own decision. Your contract obligations to any intelligence operation are terminated. What you do about your architecture contract is outside our jurisdiction. She ended the call. Kale sat in the dark studio for a long time. Then he picked up his sketchbook, opened it to the sky garden,
looked at the glass floor and the vertical planting and the water feature that would make the height the experience rather than the thing to be managed. He picked up his pencil, added a detail he'd been considering for a week but hadn't committed to, a central point on the glass floor, a specific structural element, load-bearing but minimal, almost invisible, the kind of detail that only mattered to someone who understood that the most important architecture was always the part nobody noticed. He labeled it in small letters, M.L. Malin. Ren's mother's name, which he'd found in a documentary about the Xunguan Cultural Center, watched at midnight 3 days ago on his phone with the sound low, watching a woman who'd looked like her son move through a building she was bringing back from the edge of loss. He'd wanted to put her in the building she'd never known was coming. He hadn't been sure until this moment that he had the right to. Now he thought maybe he did. Maybe that was something you could earn if you were honest enough about the cost of the attempt. He drew until dawn. Ren found him there at 6:15, which was becoming a pattern. He looked at the sketchbook, at the detail, at the two small letters. He said nothing for a long time. Then you watched the documentary. 3 days ago. She would have argued with you about the glass floor, Ren said. His voice was quiet, careful, the voice of someone handling something that mattered. She believed in opacity, interior space that protected. She'd have said the transparency was showing off. She'd have been wrong, Kale said. Something broke and rebuilt in Ren's expression. Yes, he said, she would have been. He looked at the detail, at the two letters. She'd have loved it anyway. She loved things that argued with her. Kale looked up at him. Director Shen called last night, he said. It's over, the operation, the handler, all of it. Jihai Group is officially clear. Ren nodded. I know, my contact at Oversight confirmed it an hour ago. So, Kale looked at his sketchbook. I'm no longer an operative, I'm no longer mid-mission, I'm no longer, he paused, I'm just an architect, with a non-disclosure agreement and a 6-month contract and a sky garden that needs building. Just an architect, Ren repeated. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. With complicated recent history and terrible operational discipline. And a very specific understanding of resonance problems. And that? Ren looked at him. The harbor behind him was going gold with early light. The specific morning gold that Kale had learned over 3 weeks was the best light in this building, the light that made everything in the library and the studio and the shared kitchen feel like things worth keeping. Stay, Ren said. Not a command, the specific grammar of a man who'd learned to distinguish between taking and asking and was, with some effort, choosing the harder one. Kale looked at the sketchbook, at the glass floor, at ML in small letters at the center point. I was already planning to, he said. The cage hadn't closed. He'd just realized he'd been building something else entirely. Something with better bones. 6 weeks after the confession, Kale moved the last of his things from his rented apartment in Wanchai into the residential tower. He told himself it was practical. The studio was where he worked. The project was at its most critical phase. The Meridian's revised facade specifications required 18-hour days and the kind of sustained focus that commuting interrupted. These were all true. They were also all beside the point. The point was the reading chair at the correct angle for harbor light. The point was the knock at 7 p.m. and the whiskey poured with economical precision and the arguments about structural philosophy that lasted until the city went quiet below them. The point was that he'd stopped being able to locate the boundary between the building he was constructing and the life he was apparently building inside it. And somewhere in the last 6 weeks, he decided that the inability to find that boundary wasn't a problem to solve. It was an answer to a question he'd been asking since he was 7 years old, tracing wall lines through plaster. Where do you belong? Here, apparently inconveniently, completely. Mako supervised the moving process with the expression of a man who had predicted this outcome 11 weeks ago and was too professional to say so. Dao provided moving boxes with the efficiency of someone who'd quietly had them ready for 2 weeks. Ren was at a board meeting for the Meridian's revised financing structure, the replacement for the Cheng Consortium withdrawal, which had been resolved through a combination of Ren's existing relationships and 3 new development partners who'd materialized with suspicious convenience once Director Shen's clearance documentation had circulated through the right channels. Official clearance had a way of opening doors. Kale was arranging his books on the studio's shelving, his own books now alongside the architectural references Ren had quietly added over 6 weeks, their collections interleaving with the naturalness of things that had been looking for each other, when his phone rang. Wei, his sister. He answered immediately. The payment went through, she said without preamble. Her voice had the specific quality of someone who'd been holding their breath for a long time and had just exhaled. Dad's next 3 treatment cycles are fully funded. The clinic called this morning. They said it came through a medical foundation, but she paused. Kale, it's a lot. It's more than the treatments. It covers everything, all of it, the whole debt. Kale sat down on the floor of his studio among unpacked boxes with his back against the shelving and closed his eyes. Good, he said. Wei stopped. He could hear her working through it. His sister was an engineer like their mother, precise and thorough, and she would work through it until she had the shape of it. It's him, isn't it? The person you're working for. It's complicated. Kale, her voice went careful in the way of someone choosing words for something they'd been waiting to say. I've been watching your messages for 6 weeks. You answer slower than you used to. You sound different. Different how? Less like you're performing being okay, a pause, more like you actually are. Kale opened his eyes, looked at the harbor through the studio windows. The afternoon light was doing the thing it did at this hour, turning the water a specific shade of gray gold that he'd started thinking of as the meridian's color, the color of something ambitious and honest, and still becoming what it meant to be. It's still complicated, he said. Is he good to you? The question was so direct and so way that something in his chest loosened painfully. Yes, he said, in ways I didn't expect and am still figuring out how to receive. Then the rest is just logistics. Her voice was warm and certain in the way of someone who'd watched her brother perform fine for 5 years and was relieved to be done with the performance. Come home when you can, bring him if you want. Mom will argue with him about engineering philosophy and Dad will fall asleep during dinner and it will be completely normal. He might argue back, Kale said, about foundations specifically. Good, she needs someone who argues back. Wei laughed, the real one, the one that sounded like their childhood kitchen. I love you, call more. She hung up. Kale sat on the studio floor for another minute, among boxes and books and the specific comfortable disorder of a life being installed in a space that had been waiting for it, and let himself feel the full uncomplicated weight of things getting better. It was an unfamiliar sensation. He'd been so long in the architecture of problems that the open space of things resolving felt almost structurally suspicious. The way a room with no load-bearing walls felt wrong until you understood the building well enough to trust the engineering. He trusted this building. He stood up, went back to unpacking, put his mother's photograph on the windowsill beside the harbor view because she deserved to see the water. Ren came home at 7:43. Kale heard the main door, heard the specific sequence of sounds he'd learned over 6 weeks, jacket keys, the brief silence that meant Ren was checking the day's messages before allowing himself to be done with it, then footsteps, then the interior door. One knock. In here, Kale called from the studio. Ren appeared in the doorway and looked at the half-unpacked boxes with an expression that started at neutral and shifted through something he didn't entirely close off before Kale caught it. Something that looked like a man seeing something he'd wanted for a long time arriving in physical form and not being entirely certain what to do with the reality of it. The Wan Chai apartment, he said. Given up the lease, Kale kept his voice even, watched Ren process this. Practically speaking, commuting was. Kale, Ren's voice was quiet. Oh yes. Stop giving me practical reasons. He looked at the photograph on the windowsill, Kale's mother, small and precise with the harbor behind her, squinting slightly against the light. Then he looked at Kale. Are you here because you want to be here? Kale met his eyes, yes. Ren nodded once with the slow deliberateness he used for decisions that mattered. Then he crossed the studio, picked up the nearest box, and started helping unpack with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly where things should go. Which was because, of course, it was exactly right. He put the structural engineering references on the upper shelf without being told, slotted the sketching supplies into the drafting table's side cabinet at the angle that made them accessible without being disruptive, stood the rolled site plans against the north wall where the light wouldn't fade them. He knew this space, he'd been paying attention to it for weeks. The board meeting, Kale said, passing him a stack of books. Resolved, Ren shelved them precisely. The 3 new partners have committed, the Meridian is fully refinanced, timeline intact. A pause. Sierra wants to begin the Sky Garden structural work in 3 weeks. She needs your glass floor specifications confirmed. I'll have them Thursday. She'll say Wednesday. She can say Wednesday, she'll get Thursday. Kale handed him another stack. The glass floor composite requires a specific load calculation that I'm not rushing because she has opinions about timelines. Something moved at the corner of Ren's mouth. Tell her that. I plan to. They unpacked in companionable efficiency until the studio was ordered. Not the sterile order of the professionally arranged space it had been 6 weeks ago, but the particular ordered disorder of somewhere genuinely inhabited strata of use and preference, and the accumulated detail of someone who worked and thought and lived in a space rather than merely occupied it. When they finished, Ren looked around at the result, at the photograph on the windowsill, at the reading chair that had migrated from the library to the studio corner at some point in the last 3 weeks without either of them formally acknowledging the migration. Better, he said. It was already good. It was correct, he looked at Kale, this is better.
The handler situation resolved itself in the fourth week with the specific anticlimactic quality of bureaucratic processes, not with confrontation or consequence in any visible sense, but with a set of official documents, a series of meetings Kale attended via encrypted video call, and a final debrief with Director Shen that lasted 4 hours and covered everything from the initial recruitment to the Cheng Consortium operation to the oversight failures that had allowed an unauthorized destabilization campaign to run for 14 months inside official infrastructure. The handler was reassigned. Not prosecuted, the machinery of institutional protection was what it was, but removed from field operations permanently and relocated to an administrative position in a city that was not Hong Kong and was not relevant to anything Kale had built here. The development competitor who'd funded the secondary operation was a different matter. Ren handled that. Kale didn't ask for specifics. He asked once obliquely about what handling it meant, and Ren had said, "Nothing permanent, nothing that can't be undone if they choose to behave correctly going forward." He'd paused. "I'm trying something different. Instead of elimination, sustained inconvenience, it's an experiment." "In what?" "In whether I can solve problems without becoming the version of myself I'm trying not to be." He'd looked at Kale with a directness that had no performance in it. "I find I have more motivation to try that experiment than I did 6 months ago." Kale had not known what to do with that. He'd done what he increasingly did with things from Ren that he didn't know how to process. He'd filed them in the structural memory of what they were building and trusted that the shape would become clearer as the construction progressed. The first real fight happened over the Meridian's lobby. Not the Sky Garden, not the facade, not any of the genuinely complex structural decisions Kale had expected to become flashpoints. The lobby, 40 meters of entrance space at street level that the original design had specified as open plan, minimal, the understated confidence of a building that didn't need to announce itself. Ren wanted a water feature. "The lobby is the building's handshake," Kale said, at the drafting table, blueprints spread between them, 6 weeks of working dinners having apparently not resolved their fundamental philosophical differences about transitional space. "It should be efficient, welcoming but not performative. The building statement is made by the whole, not the entrance." "Water manages acoustic environment," Ren said, with the particular calm of someone who'd thought about this before arriving to the conversation. "The Meridian's lobby will serve 800 residents and 2 floors of commercial tenancy. At peak times, the acoustic environment without intervention will be manageable with material selection, acoustic panels in the ceiling coffers, strategic placement of the reception desk as a sound buffer." "Impersonal," Ren's voice was even. "You're solving an engineering problem, I'm describing an experience." "You're describing a cliché?" Kale looked at him. "Corporate lobbies have water features, hotels have water features, the Meridian has." He stopped, reconsidered. "What experience specifically?" Ren was quiet for a moment. "The harbor moved beyond the studio windows. When my mother brought me to buildings she was restoring," he said, "she always had me close my eyes in the entrance and stand there for a minute before I looked. She said that the first thing you should know about a building is how it sounds and how it smells." He looked at the blueprints. "The Meridian should sound like arrival, like something changing, not background music, not HVAC drone. Something that tells the body it's entered a different quality of space." Kale looked at the lobby specifications, then at Ren, then at the blueprints again. "Not a feature," he said slowly. "A threshold." He picked up his pencil. "A narrow channel, not a pool, recessed into the floor line along the entrance axis, barely visible from above but audible at standing level, moving water but contained. The sound disperses upward into the ceiling volume rather than filling the horizontal space." He sketched quickly. "You hear it before you see it, then you see it and it's smaller than you expected. It's not decorative, it's informational. It tells you that you've crossed into somewhere considered." Ren looked at the sketch. "Yes," he said that. Kale looked up. "I'm still right that the original design didn't need it." "You're right that it was functional without it." Ren's almost smile appeared. "I'm right that functional and considered are different things." "We were both partly right." "We usually are." He took the pencil from Kale's hand with the easy authority of someone who'd stopped asking permission for small intimacies 3 weeks ago and added a detail to the sketch, the specific width of the channel, which Kale realized was exactly correct for the acoustic dispersion he described. "That's why this works." Kale looked at the detail, at the hand that had drawn it. "You studied architecture." "For 2 years, before the Jihai group required other priorities." Ren set the pencil down. "I know enough to understand what you're doing, not enough to do it myself." "You could have." "Different life." His voice was flat but not closed, the flatness of a fact accepted rather than a wound avoided. "This life has other things in it." Kale looked at him. "Is that enough?" Ren met his eyes. "It is now," he said simply, without the weight of a statement trying to be more than it was. It was enough. Kale's suppressants ran out in week 7. Not dramatically, not with the sudden heat crisis he'd been managing against for 5 years. His Omega biology was too well regulated for that, and the transition off suppressants after long-term use was a slow recalibration rather than a sudden return to baseline. But the appointment with his own physician in Causeway Bay confirmed what he'd been aware of for 2 weeks. The dosage was no longer working as it had, the extended use had created a tolerance plateau, and continuing at the current level offered neither the physiological benefits nor any meaningful suppression effect. He needed to either increase the dose significantly or stop. He sat in the clinic's consultation room for 20 minutes after his physician left, looking at the options sheet, and understood with the specific clarity of someone confronting a decision they'd been avoiding that this was not actually a medical question. It was the question underneath all the medical questions, the one he'd been answering in increments for 7 weeks without acknowledging he was answering it. "What are you suppressing against?" Ren had asked in the first weeks. "Power imbalances," Kale had said. He drove back to the tower through early evening Hong Kong traffic with the prescription unfilled in his pocket and sat in the studio for an hour before he knocked on the interior door himself. First time, he'd always waited for the knock to come to him. Ren opened it. He looked at Kale, at whatever was in Kale's face. His expression shifted from the contained evening composure to something more alert, more present. "Come in," he said. They went to the library, sat in their chairs. Ren didn't pour drinks. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his full attention on Kale and waited with the patience of someone who'd learned that the things worth hearing required the space to arrive. "My suppressants," Kale said. Ren was still. "Long-term tolerance, they're not working anymore." He looked at his hands. "I need to decide whether to escalate the dosage or stop using them." "What does your physician recommend?" "She was neutral, my choice." He looked up. "She noted that I'm healthy, that long-term high-dose suppression has its own physiological costs, that if my life circumstances have changed sufficiently to make natural cycle management viable," he paused, "it might be worth considering." Ren said nothing. His expression was careful, the particular care of someone who understood that the wrong word here mattered. "I've been on suppressants since I was 24, Kale said. "Every relationship I've had in that time was managed, controlled, no scent bond, no heat complications, no omega biology making decisions that the rest of me hadn't authorized." He looked at Ren directly. "I used them as architecture, built walls with them, against dynamics I didn't trust." "I know," Ren said quietly. "I'm telling you because," Kale stopped, "because if I stop, things will change, my scent signature will change, my biology will recalibrate, and that affects us." He held Ren's gaze. "And I don't make decisions that affect us without telling you." The word "us" sat between them like a structural element being load-tested. Ren leaned back in his chair, looked at the harbor, looked at Kale. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to stop," Kale said. "I want to stop building walls against things I've decided to trust." He paused. "But I want to make sure that's my decision and not my biology's, because those are different things and I've spent 5 years making sure they stay different." "How do you tell the difference?" "I ask myself if I'd make the same choice with full suppression. If the answer is yes," Kale's voice was even, "it's mine." Ren was quiet, the harbor light moved. "And is it?" he asked. "Yes," Kale said, "it is." Ren stood, crossed to Kale's chair with 3 unhurried steps, crouched in front of him so their eyes were level, which was a gesture that had nothing performative in it, just a man making himself equal to the conversation rather than above it. "Then stop," he said, "on your terms, at your pace. If anything about how it unfolds doesn't feel right, you tell me immediately." He held Kale's gaze. "I don't want your biology making choices for you any more than you do. I want," he paused, working toward the precise word, "you, the version that chooses, that argues with me about lobbies and reads every contract before signing and traces wall lines and plaster at age 7. His hand came up and pressed flat against Kale's sternum. "Not possessive, just present. That's who I want. Everything else is detail." Kale looked at him, at the scar through his left brow, at the serpent tattoo and the exhaustion that had slowly been resolving over weeks into something that looked like, not ease exactly, but the particular rest of someone no longer spending all their energy defending against loss. "You're going to be insufferably right about this," Kale said. "Probably," the almost smile real all the way through. "You'll tell me when I am." "Immediately and in detail." "I'm counting on it." Week 9, the Sky Garden structural work began. Kale was on site at 7 a.m., standing on the 32nd floor with Sierra and the structural engineer, and a team of workers who were about to start laying the glass-reinforced composite floor that would make the height the experience rather than the thing to be managed. Ren stood to one side, not directing, just present the way he was present at all the significant moments of the Meridian's construction, not supervising but witnessing, as though the building mattered enough to deserve someone who saw it becoming. The first composite panel went in at 7:40. Kale watched the floor begin to take shape beneath them. Through the glass, Hong Kong spread in every direction, the harbor to the south, Kowloon spreading north, the mountains catching morning cloud. The city below looked exactly as it should from 32 floors.
exactly as it had in his head since the first time he'd stood in this space and listened to what it wanted. There, Sierra said, standing at the eastern edge, looking down through the new floor at the city beneath. Her voice had something in it that veteran site foremen rarely allowed. There it is. Kale stood beside her and looked down. The composite was flawless. The structural calculation was sound. The height was the experience. He felt Ren move to stand beside him. They looked down at Hong Kong through glass together, the city going about its enormous business 32 floors below, entirely indifferent to the fact that two people were standing above it in the building they'd made between them, not just the meridian, but the other thing, the harder thing, the one without blueprints. The water feature, Kale said, for the garden space I've been thinking about positioning. And north end as I originally proposed, but angled, not perpendicular to the edge, diagonal, so the sound travels across the space rather than containing it. He paused. It'll create a directional acoustic experience. You'll hear it before you see it, and when you turn to find the source, you'll have turned to face the harbor view. Ren was quiet for a moment. You're designing it so the first thing you look for leads you to the best view. The building should help people find what they came for. Kale looked at the harbor through the glass floor, even if they didn't know that's what they were looking for. Ren looked at him. The morning light caught the angles of his face with the gold-gray quality Kale had learned was the best light in this building. You're describing more than water features, Ren said. I'm describing good architecture. Kale met his eyes, they're the same thing. Something settled in Ren's expression. The specific settling of a man who'd spent a long time in the architecture of defense and was, with effort and intention, learning to live in something built for different purposes. The ML detail, he said, in the glass floor center point. I wanted to ask you properly, Kale said. I put it in the sketch before I had the right to, but I'd like to, if it's something you want, make it a formal element. The structural documentation would note it as the primary load transfer point, technically accurate. Also, he paused, a permanent record, in a building that will still be standing in 100 years. Ren looked at the floor beneath them, at the city through the glass, at the center point where the composite panels met in their precise geometric convergence. Amel, he said quietly, Malin, his mother's name in the bones of the building. Yes. A long silence, the crane cables sang above them. Somewhere below, Seoul was waking up in the spaces between Hong Kong's heartbeat. Yes, Ren said, his voice was contained, careful with something precious. Make it formal. Kale looked at the building around them, at the sky through the open upper structure, at the man beside him who over-engineered foundations and finished dead women's buildings and had waited 3 weeks to see which direction Kale would fall and had quietly arranged family protection before he'd known. He thought about his handler and the mission brief, and the 6 months of carefully maintained distance that had collapsed anyway, not because his biology had decided for him, but because the building had been more honest than the lie. The bones remember, Ren's mother had said, even if everything visible has been damaged. I need to tell you something, Kale said. Ren looked at him, present, unguarded. I came here to take this building apart. Kale held his gaze, and instead I helped it become what it was trying to be. He paused. I think that's the most accurate description of the last 9 weeks. Ren's expression moved through something complicated then and now. Now I'm the Meridian's architect of record. He turned back to the harbor view, and I'd like to keep that job permanently if the terms are agreeable. The almost smile appeared, the terms are negotiable. They always are. But non-negotiable on certain points. Which points? Ren looked at him, the harbor gold behind him, the building becoming around them. The architect stays in the building, he said. Everything else is detail. Kale looked at the glass floor, at ML at the center point, at 32 floors of open sky and city below them. Those terms are acceptable, he said. That evening, for the first time since the confession, Kale sat in the library reading chair that was his without the suppressant distance between his own senses and the room. The recalibration had been slow, as his physician had predicted, not an event but a gradual returning, like a building's temperature normalizing after years of artificial climate control. What he noticed first was the library itself. The cedar of the shelving, which he'd registered abstractly before, now had depth and warmth to it. The quality of the room's air, old books, sea air coming through the ventilation, the particular note of a space that had been lived in and cared for. What he noticed second was Ren. Across the room, working through documents at his desk with the door between the library and office open, the way he worked most evenings now. Cedar and black pepper and the warmer note underneath that Kale's biology had been working to ignore for 9 weeks and was no longer required to. Not overwhelming, not the loss of self his suppressants had been protecting against. Just true, the scent of a specific person in a specific place, which was the most honest thing a space could contain. Ren looked up from his documents. Looked at Kale. Something in his expression shifted, barely, the way a building shifts when a load is properly seated, the specific small adjustment of something finding its correct position. Better, he asked. Accurate, Kale said. Ren held his gaze for a moment, then returned to his documents with a small curve at the corner of his mouth that was the most private version of the almost smile. Kale picked up his book. Outside, Hong Kong glittered with its beautiful, indifferent light. The Meridian climbed toward its completion 48 floors and one sky garden and one water feature and one glass floor and ML, at the center point away from the building it had been before Kale had stood on the 32nd floor and listened to what it was trying to become. The bones remember. Even this, especially this. The moment before the last wall went up and something that had been building in the dark finally, quietly, permanently arrived. The Meridian topped out on a Tuesday in November. Construction language for the moment the final structural element reaches its highest point, the last steel beam seated, the building complete in its bones if not yet in its skin. Tradition demanded a small ceremony. A flag or a tree branch fixed to the topmost point, workers gathered, the acknowledgement that something significant had been achieved before the harder work of finishing began. Zira organized it with the efficiency she applied to everything. 40 workers on the roof level, coffee and food from a catering company she'd used for 15 years, a small Taiwanese flag because 3 of the structural team were from Taipei and she believed in specificity over generality. The flag went up at 9:14 a.m. in a clean November wind off the harbor and everyone on the roof level watched it catch and held the specific silence of people who'd built something together and knew it. Kale stood at the roof edge and looked at Hong Kong from 48 floors and felt the building beneath him with his whole body, the solid, specific reality of structure that had existed first as lines on paper, then as an argument about resonance in a moving car, then as a question about what a space wanted to become. And was now steel and glass and composite flooring, and a water feature on the 32nd floor that turned you toward the harbor and ML at the center point of a glass floor that made the height the experience. It was real, it was standing, it would stand for a long time. You're doing the thing, Sierra said, appearing beside him with 2 coffees, one of which she pressed into his hand with the no-nonsense warmth of someone who'd worked construction sites for 30 years and knew what people looked like when buildings moved them. What thing? The listening thing, she looked out at the city. You do it on every floor, stand in the center, go quiet, listen. She sipped her coffee. My first foreman told me the good architects hear things in buildings that other people can't. I thought he was being poetic. A pause. Now I think he meant it literally. Kale looked at the building spreading below them. What does this one sound like to you? Sierra considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Like it knows what it is, she said finally. Some buildings spend their whole life trying to figure that out. This one, she tilted her head at the flag snapping above them, already knows. Ren arrived at 9:40, which was later than Kale had expected and which immediately suggested something had required managing. He appeared from the stairwell access rather than the construction elevator, another sign, because Ren used the elevator when he had time and the stairs when he didn't, and found Kale at the roof edge with the quiet directness of a man who knew exactly where to look. He stood beside him, looked at the flag, looked at the city. The Lim Group, he said, which confirmed Kale's suspicion, attempting to file a competing development claim on the Kowloon site through a proxy corporation, 3rd attempt in 4 months. His jaw was tight with the particular controlled tightness of someone who'd handled the immediate problem and was now managing the residual frustration. My legal team is responding, it won't succeed. The development competitor, Kale said still. The sustained inconvenience experiment has limits. Ren's voice was dry. I'm revising my hypothesis. Meaning? Meaning some problems require more direct architecture. He looked at the flag. I'm meeting with their principal investor next week. Directly, I find that face-to-face conversations resolve certain misunderstandings more efficiently than legal correspondence. Kale looked at him. Is that the version of yourself you're trying not to be? Ren was quiet for a moment. It's the conversation, not the consequences. He met Kale's eyes. I'm attempting to distinguish between the two. It requires more precision than elimination, but the outcome is more durable. More durable, Kale repeated. Things built correctly last. Ren looked back at the flag. Things ended violently create successors. Kale thought about this, your father. My grandfather chose negotiation and lost him anyway. Ren's voice was even. I spent 20 years concluding the lesson was that negotiation was the failure. I'm reconsidering the interpretation. A pause. Maybe the lesson was that half measures fail. Full negotiation, real, direct, complete, might be different from the performance of it while preparing for violence. You're genuinely trying, Kale said. I told you I have more motivation than I did a year ago. He didn't look at Kale when he said it, looked at Hong Kong, all its glittering complexity. The experiment requires data, I'm collecting it. Below them, Sierra was directing the catering team with military precision. Workers were eating and talking in the easy way of people who'd spent months in proximity building something real together and had arrived at the specific fellowship of shared work well done. Mako stood near the stairwell access with his flat evaluating eyes cataloging everything in the way that never fully stopped regardless of context. Mako, Kale said, does he ever stop being on duty? No, Ren's tone was fond in the compressed way of someone who expressed fondness through acknowledgement rather than warmth. He'd tell you he considers it a character trait rather than a professional habit. A pause. He's probably right. He told me you wouldn't hurt me before the confession. Kale looked at his coffee cup. He said whatever happened, that wasn't who you were. Ren was quiet. He was right, Kale said. I wanted you to know that I know that it wasn't a small thing having someone say it when I needed to hear it. Mako says necessary things, Ren said. He always has. He paused. He told me 3 weeks before your confession that you were carrying something that was going to either break you or break toward me. He said either way I should be ready. A beat. He said you were worth being ready for. Kale looked at him. And were you? Ren met his eyes with the full undefended attention that had never lost its capacity to catch Kale completely off guard. I've been ready for you since you told me what the north facade resonance problem was going to do to the upper residential units on the day we met. He paused. I didn't know that's what it was yet, but yes. The November wind moved across the roof. The flag snapped above them. The city spread in all directions at the specific altitude of a building that knew what it was. Kale reached out and pressed his hand flat against the nearest structural column, feeling the building, feeling 48 floors of deliberate over-engineered permanent construction beneath his palm. I want to show you something, he said. They went down alone 32 floors to the Sky Garden. The space was transformed. 6 weeks of intensive work since the glass floor installation had brought the vertical planting to 2/3 completion. Bamboo species and ornamental grasses and climbing plants trained onto the structural frames, creating the wall-less sense of enclosure Kale had described to Ren on the first site visit. The water feature was operational, a narrow diagonal channel recessed into the floor line, the sound of moving water dispersing upward into the ceiling volume with exactly the acoustic quality he'd calculated. And the glass floor catching the November light, the harbor visible through it in 4 directions, Hong Kong below them patient and indifferent and beautiful. ML at the center point. Ren stopped when he saw it completed for the first time. He'd seen the components individually, the floor, the planting, the water feature at various stages, but not assembled, not as what it was. He stood at the threshold for a moment that Kale didn't interrupt. Then he walked to the center, stood over ML with the city visible through the glass beneath his feet, looked up at the open sky and out at the harbor and down at the composite floor with his mother's initials at the point where all the structural load transferred. Kale stood at the edge of the space and let him have it. After a long time, Ren said, without turning, she would have stood exactly where I'm standing. I know. She would have looked down at the city and then up at the sky and said something about the relationship between foundation and aspiration. A pause. She used to say that buildings were the only human things that pointed in both directions simultaneously, rooted and reaching. She was right. She usually was. He turned. His face was the most open Kale had ever seen it, not the careful openness of the library evenings or the controlled openness of the confession night, but something prior to management, something that had simply arrived without waiting for permission. This is the best thing anyone has ever done for me. Kale looked at the center point, at ML in the bones of a building that would stand for 100 years. It's what the space wanted, he said. She was already here, I just made it formal. Ren crossed the glass floor toward him and stopped at the distance that had once been their professional boundary and was now simply the distance before closer, which they crossed with the ease of people who'd stopped pretending there was a reason not to. He put his hands on Kale's face with the careful precision of a man handling something that mattered. I need to ask you something, he said. Ask? Not about the buildings. I know. Ren looked at him. The harbor light moved through the glass floor below them. The water feature sent its sound upward and outward, filling the space with the signal that said you've arrived somewhere considered. Stay, he said, not the word from 6 weeks ago that had been an opening tentative beneath its certainty. This was something further along, solid in its structure. Not the contract, not the meridian after the meridian, here in this building. He paused, working toward precision in what we've built, in what we are. Kale looked at him, at the scar and the tattoo and the exhaustion that had become something else over months, something that looked increasingly like a man learning to live in the open rather than behind fortification. At the person who had waited to see which direction Kale would fall and had quietly arranged protection before he knew. Who argued back about water features and over-engineered every foundation and had spent 11 years completing a building for a woman who taught him that bones were everything. You're asking me to stay permanently, Kale said. Yes, in a building I helped design. Which I find entirely appropriate. The almost smile full and real, the architect should inhabit his work. That's not standard practice. I'm not interested in standard practice. I'm interested in, Ren's thumbs traced Kale's cheekbones, you, specifically permanently, with full awareness of the complexity and the history and the fact that we are both, he paused, substantially imperfect structures. With good bones, Kale said.
With very good bones, Ren's voice was low, the rest is ongoing construction. Kale looked at the space around them, the sky garden that had been 32 floors of open steel when he'd first stood here and told Ren what it wanted to become, the glass floor that made the height the experience, the water feature pointing you toward the harbor, ML at the center. He thought about his 7-year-old self tracing wall lines through plaster, about a building trying to be what it had been and what it had become simultaneously, about how he'd found that interesting then and still found it interesting now, the specific interest of someone who understood that the most compelling structures were never purely one thing. He thought about his mother's photograph on the studio windowsill, about Wei saying come home when you can, bring him if you want, about his father's treatment funded and his family stable and the particular relief of people who love you no longer being the thing someone can use against you. He thought about the mission brief and the handler and the 6 months of careful professional distance that had collapsed anyway, not into disaster, but into something that had turned out to have better bones than either the mission or the distance. The Meridian opens in 4 months, he said. Yes, I'll need to be on site through the opening, daily presence through punch list completion, commissioning, final inspections. He met Ren's eyes. After that, the active construction engagement reduces. My presence becomes less professionally mandated. Yes, Ren said again. I'm saying I'll be underfoot regardless of whether you ask me to stay. I know, the almost smile deepened. I'm asking anyway, I find I prefer things explicitly negotiated. He held Kale's gaze. Architecture of record, permanent basis, non-negotiable on certain points. Which points? You stay in the building, steady, certain, everything else we figure out as we go. Kale looked at him for a long moment, feeling the building beneath them. 48 floors of deliberate permanent construction over-engineered for everything it would ever be asked to bear. Yes, he said. Ren exhaled, the specific exhale of someone who'd been holding something at tension for a long time and had just been given permission to release it. His forehead dropped to Kale's, their gesture, the one that had started the night of the confession and had become the physical shorthand for I see you, I'm here, this is real. One condition, Kale said against his temple. Name it. The lobby water feature if it doesn't work acoustically at full occupancy. Ren laughed, actual, unguarded, the sound of a man who'd stopped performing composure at least in this room, in this building, with this person. It transformed his face in the way Kale had first seen 6 weeks ago and had been quietly cataloging ever since as one of the best structural features of anything he'd ever been inside. Then you fix it, Ren said, because you're the architect of record permanently. Permanently, Kale agreed. They stood on the glass floor until the November light changed. The harbor moved below them, Hong Kong breathed. The water feature sent its sound upward into the space with patient consistency, telling anyone who listened that they'd arrived somewhere considered. At some point, Mako appeared at the garden threshold, took in the scene with his flat evaluating eyes, and withdrew without comment. His footsteps receded toward the stairwell with the timing of a man who'd been positioned there for a while and had received the outcome he'd been waiting for. Sierra's voice came distantly from the upper floors, directing, organizing, the sound of the building's remaining work continuing around this still point. Kale looked down through the glass at the city spreading 40 stories below, at the harbor and the towers, and the movement of 8 million lives going about their enormous business, entirely indifferent to the 2 people standing above it in a building that knew what it was. He pressed his palm flat against the glass floor. Felt the building. Rooted and reaching, Ren's mother had said, the only human things that point in both directions simultaneously. He understood that now in ways he hadn't when he'd arrived in the city with a handler's brief and a family's debt, and the careful architecture of 5 years of professional distance held up against everything that wanted to get in. The distance had failed. The building had not. What are you thinking? Ren asked. Quiet, his hand at the small of Kale's back, warm and present, the gesture of someone who'd learned to ask rather than assume. About what this floor looked like the first time I stood here, Kale looked at ML at the center point. Just steel, no floor, no planting, no water, open to the sky on all sides. He paused. You asked me what it wanted to become. And you heard it. I told you what I heard, he looked up, you trusted it enough to build it. Ren was quiet for a moment. That's what this is, he said, what we've done. The Meridian. All of it, his hand pressed slightly at Kale's back. You told me what you heard, I trusted it enough to build. Kale looked at him, at the face that had stopped performing anything in this room, in this light, at this altitude. I heard something good, he said. So did I, Ren's voice was low. From the first day, I just had to wait for you to say it. Outside, Hong Kong went about its enormous life, the harbor moved, the November light shifted toward afternoon. The Meridian stood at 48 floors and knew exactly what it was. Rooted and reaching. The bones remember. Even this. Especially this.
Two imperfect structures, over-engineered where it mattered, building something permanent from the honest wreckage of the attempt. The Meridian opened on a Friday in March. 800 residents, 2 floors of commercial tenancy, a sky garden on the 32nd floor where the glass floor made the height the experience, and the water feature turned you toward the harbor, and ML sat at the center point in the bones of a building that would still be standing in 100 years. The lobby water feature worked perfectly acoustically at full occupancy. Kale did not mention this to Ren. Ren mentioned it to Kale, in the specific tone of a man who had been right about something and had the professional restraint not to say so directly. Kale told him he'd gotten lucky. Ren said that correct architectural instinct and luck were distinguishable concepts. Kale said not always. They argued about it in the lobby for 11 minutes while the opening reception moved around them, and Mako stood near the entrance looking professionally unsurprised, and Sierra watched from the atrium with an expression of a woman who had built something and was watching it be fully inhabited. Dao appeared at Ren's shoulder at some point with a quietly urgent message that required attention. Ren looked at it, looked at Kale, finished his sentence about acoustic modeling before excusing himself because he had, over the months of construction, learned that the architectural arguments were more important than most things that presented themselves as urgent. Kale stood alone in the lobby for a moment. Listened. The water feature sent its sound upward into the ceiling volume with the patient consistency of something doing exactly what it was designed to do. The space hummed with the specific frequency of a building at full occupancy, voices, movement, the ambient warmth of people in a space they were beginning to understand was theirs. He put his hand flat against the nearest column. Felt the bones. Good bones, over-engineered, permanent. The most important architecture always invisible, the part that made everything else possible. He thought about his mother and her drainage systems, and how nobody noticed the work that kept everything from flooding. About Ren's mother and the colonial building completed 7 years late for a woman who'd never seen it. About restoration, architecture, and structural memory, and the idea that the best buildings remembered what they'd been built to be even through everything that tried to damage them. He thought about a handler and a mission brief, and a contract signed with ink that dried into something neither party had intended. About confessions in libraries and emergency reports at 2 in the morning, and a man who'd arranged family protection before he knew which direction the fall would go. About suppressants that had finally been dispensed with entirely, as of 3 months ago, and the specific experience of being fully present in a space for the first time in 5 years. The cedar and black pepper of a person he knew as well as any building he'd ever inhabited, better than most. Ren reappeared at his shoulder. The limb situation, he said. Resolved. The meeting happened yesterday. The principal investor has agreed to redirect their development interest to 3 sites that don't conflict with Jihai operations. He paused. Full negotiation, no supplementary measures. Kale looked at him, the experiment. Successful, at least in this case. Ren's tone held something that wasn't quite satisfaction, something more careful, more provisional, the tone of someone updating a hypothesis rather than celebrating a conclusion. I'm revising my model. Toward what? Toward the possibility that the right architecture of engagement produces more durable outcomes than the alternatives. He looked at the lobby around them, at the water feature and the ceiling height and the 800 residents filling the space on their first evening. It takes longer, it requires more precision, the failure modes are different. A pause, but what it builds is. Sounder, Kale said. Ren looked at him, yes. Your mother would agree with you. She would have argued with me about it for 6 hours and then agreed with me, his almost smile full and unguarded. She argued with everything she loved. Structural trait, Kale said. Apparently. They stood in the lobby of the building they'd made together, the building that was the Meridian and the building that was everything else, the other construction, the one that had started with a resonance problem and a sky garden question and a reading chair at the correct angle for harbor light and had arrived here, at a Friday in March with a lobby water feature that was acoustically correct and ML in the bones of the 32nd floor and 2 people who had managed. Through spectacular mutual imperfection and considerable structural damage, to build something that pointed in both directions simultaneously. Rooted and reaching. The next project, Kale said. Ren looked at him, we're discussing this tonight. I've been thinking about the site in Xunwan, 3 blocks from the cultural center. Kale kept his voice level in the way of someone containing something that wanted more space than a lobby conversation. Mixed residential and cultural use. The site has particular constraints. It's surrounded on 3 sides by protected heritage structures that limit the development envelope significantly. Which means whoever designs it has to work with the limitations rather than against them, has to understand that the context is the building in some fundamental sense. He looked at Ren. It would need someone who understood that city, that specific neighborhood, what that part of Hong Kong has been and is still trying to be. Ren was quiet, the lobby moved around them. It would need to be right, he said, that neighborhood. Yes, my mother's building is on the same street. I know. A long pause, the water feature, the harbor-facing glass of the entrance, the city beyond it doing what cities did, moving and building and tearing down and building again, the enormous patient cycle of places that survive their own history. Send me the site analysis, Ren said. It's already in your files. Ren looked at him. When did you? 3 weeks ago, I was thinking about what comes next. Kale met his eyes. I find I'm interested in what comes next. Even knowing the complications. Especially knowing the complications. He looked at the lobby they'd argued into existence, the water feature and the acoustic ceiling and the correct proportions and the detail that had started as Ren's instinct and become something more precise through the argument between them. The complications are where the building gets honest. Ren reached out and pressed his hand flat against the column beside Kale's, beside the hand Kale had placed there while listening to the building. 2 palms against the same structural element. The building between them and beneath them and around them, bones and skin and all its occupied, inhabited, fully realized self. Send me the timeline too, Ren said. Already there. The almost smile. Of course it is. Later, when the opening reception had resolved into the quieter evening of a building settling into occupation, the last guests departing, the staff completing the close, Mako making his final perimeter check with the thoroughness of a man who would make it the same way every night for as long as the building stood, Kale went to the Sky Garden alone. Stood at the center point. Looked down through the glass at Hong Kong below. Looked up at the March sky, clear and deep, the specific darkness of a city sky that holds its light close. Felt the building under his feet. 48 floors of deliberate construction, over-engineered at the foundations, built to last the century, carrying ML at its center like a name held in the bones of something permanent. He heard Ren's footsteps behind him, recognized them, the specific weight and rhythm of a person you know well enough to identify in the dark. Ren stopped beside him at the center point, looked down at the city, looked up at the sky. They stood in the space they'd made and were quiet together with the particular quality of people who'd said everything that needed saying and had arrived at the other side of it, where the words were less necessary because the structure held them. It's good, Ren said. Not the building, Kale knew that. He'd learned to hear what Ren meant underneath what Ren said, the way you learn to hear a building's structural language once you'd spent enough time inside it. Yes, Kale said. Not just good, lasting. The specific quality they'd both been building toward from different directions for different reasons, and had arrived at together in the only way lasting things were actually built, imperfectly over time, with better bones than either party had expected to find in the other. Below them, Hong Kong glittered. Above them, the March sky held its depth. Between them, in the building and the other building, the one without blueprints, the one they were still constructing, everything that had been earned and damaged and honestly rebuilt from the wreckage of the attempt. 2 broken people, Ren had said once in the ruins of the estate, who somehow found each other. Kale pressed his palm to the glass floor. Felt the bones. The most important architecture is always invisible, his mother had told him, the part that makes everything else possible. He understood that now completely. Not the building, never just the building. The part underneath, the part that held. That was what lasted. That was what they'd built. Now please hit that subscribe button. It's completely free, and I wanted to ask you about past commit and commit section. I am promising you I will read every single commit and try to reply to it.